Good afternoon. I guess you could call the first few sentences a prelude, if a short story has a prelude. But in actuality, it is a bit from the local newspaper. Tom McBride, chief of police, announced that there was a burglary at J.C. Penney's store on Saturday night or early Sunday morning. He would not elaborate on what was stolen, but indicated it was of little value and the perpetrators may very well have been juveniles. October the 25th, 1957. The title of this story is The Heist. Otis Murphy lived as close to the earth as anyone can. Partly by choice and partly by necessity, he owned almost nothing. He lived in a two-room shack deep in the woods, whose only access was a footpath that led a quarter of a mile from the main highway. The house was located at the edge of what was referred to as a swamp. To some extent, it was a swamp, as the river had changed its course several times over the last 1,000 years and scarred the terrain with crevices that, in some cases and sometimes, still held water. This was a breeding ground for mosquitoes, copperheads, and cottonmouths, but it was also an oasis for wild game that he could secure that were coming to secure food and drink. This made Otis's quest for existence easier. Within a few-minute walk from his house, he could easily claim the day's food supply for the cost of a few pennies of rifle cartridges. His daily pilgrimage to this natural meat market was necessary, however, as his home had no electricity or refrigeration. He planted a few vegetables, and there were some fruit and nut trees along the path leading to the highway. Even with this, his diet was mainly protein and not well balanced. This contributed to his appearance of aging well beyond his years. For clothing, he would go to the local dump and wear whatever he found. It is believed he did not own a jacket, much less a coat, but his primitive living had made him immune to the elements. Otis seldom made trips into town or other points of civilization. He did not need to, and he had no money to spend if he went. Those who knew him estimated his annual income from who knows what source was about $100 a year. That he spent on ammunition for his rifle. By the early 1960s, very few people knew much about him, and if he had ever had a family, wife, or children, it was not known or expected. No one really cared. Police Chief McBride had been fond of him for some reason. Maybe just liked the simplicity of his lifestyle, or maybe he felt a little sorry for him. When Otis did come to town, the chief would occasionally drive him home or to the beginning of the path that led to his shack. The chief also knew that getting him home as soon as possible was in the best interest of all concerned. The local would tease Otis as you would tease a child. Otis, however, was no one's fool. That is, unless you gave him alcohol to entice him into telling stories. His favorite was about the Indians that lived in the woods near his home. According to him, they would attack him almost weekly, and he had killed hundreds of them over the years. He claimed they had escaped the reservation and wanted to reclaim their land. It was said that hearing Otis's stories were better than going to a John Wayne movie. After the alcohol crossed a point, however, Otis's mood would change, and he would hallucinate even beyond his imagined battle with the Indians. It was best, at this time, he be driven home. Chief McBride has died by now. The new chief, Chief Roberts, was not a native of the county and did not know the stories of the eccentric who dwelled just south of town. He did not know Otis or anything about his proclivity to tell tall tales and sometimes hallucinate, but he would soon learn. It was big news in 1960. Laverne Dugan was missing. Laverne was a beautiful 31-year-old mother and wife. Her husband came home and found their 9-month-old baby in its playpen. It was obvious the child had been there, uncared for hours. Nothing in the house was disturbed. Laverne Dugan had keys to the family car, and those keys were still at the house. But that was not unusual, as she would not have had any use for them anyway. The family only had one car, and her husband James had used it to go to work at the local lawnmower plant. What was unusual was that her purse containing identification, makeup, and $10 in cash was still there. There was no sign of a struggle. The couple's home was in a small, populated community about 3 miles south of Otis's, and a jurisdiction served by the county sheriff's office. James called the sheriff. The sheriff and a deputy arrived, looked around, secured the premises, and called the state police. This was beyond their ability to investigate. Over the next few days, there were leads, but none panned out. Within a couple of weeks, evidence began to surface that Laverne Dugan was having several extramarital affairs. One was with a prominent, older, wealthy gentleman from town. He did not want the infidelity to be known, and he had the influence to stop the investigation. Soon, her disappearance became a cold case file. To say the loss of his wife ruined James's life would be an understatement. James was what could be referred to as a good old boy. He married way beyond his standing, and Laverne had nothing in common with him. He loved her dearly, but had to admit that things in their marriage had not been good since the baby came. There was speculation that he had found out about her cheating and had killed her. This caused him to lose his job. Things went from bad to worse. He filed a claim for her $10,000 life insurance, only to be told that without a body, she was just a missing person. With no job and a baby, James was desperate. One night he went to a small remote cemetery and dug up the grave of a woman approximately the age of his wife. The woman had died 5 years prior. He took her skull and put it in a ditch not far from his house. When the skull was found a few days later by the county crew cutting the highway right-of-way, it was presumed it belonged to Laverne. At first, that is. Then it was noticed that the skull belonged to a person who wore dentures. Laverne had movie star quality teeth. Eventually, James' conscience got the best of him, and he admitted his actions. He was sentenced to 1 year suspended sentence for desecrating a grave. He did not collect the life insurance money. The spring and summer of 1963 were among the rainiest on record, and much of the land mass around Otis's house flooded. This hampered his ability to acquire food, so he waded to some of the neighbors' houses that he barely knew in search of a handout. After a couple of weeks, the water receded, and Otis returned to the lagoons that depended him affordable food. The high water had washed out a portion of the land that, prior to the flood, provided a path to his favorite hunting spots. The new route was much longer. The ground was still soft and mushy, and in some places, if you stepped in the wrong spot, you would sink to your knees. Otis had never been to a doctor of any sort, and due to his age, about 60, his eyesight was impaired. Therefore, from where he stood, he was not sure at first what he was seeing. It was too muddy to get any closer, but from 50 yards away, what he thought he had caught a glimpse of forced him to trudge through the mud a few more feet to get a better view. He could not be sure, but it looked like the arm of a person protruding upright from the mud. The hand was somewhat distinguishable, but the arm, if it was an arm, was covered with mud and leaves. Otis continued under the lagoon and claimed his meal of wild turkey and garfish he shot in the shallow water. He then went home. He reasoned the next morning the ground would be drier, and he would explore the strange apparition in a little more detail. The next day, he was about to get a little closer. Now he was positive. It was the arm of a person sticking out of the mud. Otis was smart enough to know that this could not mean anything good for him. If foul play was involved, he would certainly be a suspect. At best, his hunting area would be disturbed, and the game would be flushed by the excavation of the scene. He was faced with a dilemma. Should he report it, or should he not? Then he remembered the disappearance of Laverne Dugan. He did not know her, but he had seen her a few times, and like most men, he was enamored by her beauty. The thought of her being in that cold, wet earth bothered him. The next day, he walked the 8 miles to town. He met with Chief Roberts and explained what he had seen. Chief Roberts politely thanked him, but explained that due to the alleged location of the body, the investigation would be the sheriff's responsibility. He assured Otis he would notify the sheriff on his behalf. Later that day, Chief Roberts talked with some of the people who knew Otis. found out about the Indian stories, and subsequently dismissed the information he had learned from the man as pure foolishness. He did not tell the sheriff at that time. It was the practice of the police chief and sheriff to have breakfast once every few months to share knowledge. This is when Sheriff Case first learned about Otis's visit. He too had only been sheriff for a short while and only knew Otis by sight. He reasoned that at some point he would stop by and visit with Otis, if for no other reason than to satisfy his curiosity. It was late August, and a hurricane had blown in from Louisiana. The wind was not significant, but the rain was torrential. This time, Otis's surroundings were flooded to even a greater depth. The water was so deep he could shoot fish from his front steps. Most were trash fish, buffalo, jack, and shoepick, but it was better than begging from the neighbors. When the water receded, Otis was, to say the least, disturbed when he saw the uniformed sheriff making his way up the path to his house. Almost no one had ever visited him, especially law enforcement. Sheriff Case introduced himself, saying his visit was just to see if Otis made it through the storm okay. In a few minutes, the conversation turned to the subject Otis had discussed with Chief Roberts. "Otis, can you show me what you saw that day?" "Well, I can take you thar. I doubt it's still thar with all this flooding. You better get them shiny boots off and get barefooted." "I have some rubber boots back in the unit. I'll be right back." In a few minutes, he returned wearing the boots and carrying a Polaroid camera. The two proceeded through the mud toward the area where Otis had seen the arm a few weeks prior and before the major flooding. Sheriff Case, whose eyesight was much better than Otis's, froze in his tracks before Otis even focused on what was visible beyond. Due to the mud, they could not get within 100 yards of the object, but it could clearly be seen. Not only was there one arm visible above the mud, a few feet away another arm, a leg, and an upper torso was visible. There must have been 5 or 6 bodies buried in the mulch. The sheriff took photos and immediately returned to his patrol car where he radioed the state police. Within an hour, dozens of spectators surrounded what once was the private but primitive home of Otis Murphy. One of the spectators was James, who was sure Laverne had been a victim of a crazed killer. A young state highway patrolman put on waders and started to the nearest body. He soon sank to above his knees and had to be helped back to high ground. It was impossible to get to the bodies due to the muck. Within an hour, a lowboy tractor trailer arrived, and a bulldozer was unloaded. The once narrow footpath was cleared to a width that could accommodate vehicles, all of which were destroying the fruit trees that had once lined the path and nutritionally sustained Otis Murphy. An oil well supply firm delivered wooden pads, and a wooden walk was built across the mud. The same young state patrolman then approached the bodies. He inspected the first one carefully. He shook his head, then he began to laugh. He tugged on the arm, and the entire body came out of the mud. It was a mannequin, and still visible was the tag that read, "Property of J.C. Penney." That day, Otis Murphy's life would change forever. No longer could his primitive dwelling be hidden from view and approached only by footpath. Gone were the trees that provided him nourishment. But as it is said, Otis was no fool. He put a gate at the entrance to the widened path to his house. For a while he charged admission to show people where the 22 bodies were found. He finished the tour with the story of the Indians. Finally, when this became old news, he became a guide, taking rich city folks hunting. It did not matter if hunting was in season or not. No one bothered Otis. Laverne was still missing.